Let me tell you something about Florida. And I need you to actually listen, because people always laugh when I say this. They always smirk. They lean back and cross their arms like they already know where I'm going, like they've heard this kind of story before. They haven't. Nobody has. Because what happened in Florida in the summer of 2030 was not a story anyone prepared for. Not the military. Not NASA. Not the 12 different government agencies that had been running alien contact simulations since the 1970s. Not a single one of those people, with all their satellites and their supercomputers and their classified briefing rooms, was ready for what crawled out of that swamp. And the aliens definitely weren't ready for what crawled out to meet them. I was there. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I'm not telling you something I read in a report or heard from a guy who knew a guy. I was standing on the eastern edge of Alligator Alley when the first ship came down. I was eating a gas station sandwich that tasted like cardboard and regret, and I was watching the western sky turn colors that don't have names yet. My name is Darnell Hutchins. I was 34 years old that morning. I was a wildlife survey technician with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, which is a very long job title that basically means I drove around in a beat-up truck counting animals and filling out spreadsheets. I had been doing that job for 6 years. I knew the Everglades the way most people know their own bedroom. The sounds it made at different hours, the way the air changed when the season shifted, the places where the water sat still, and the places where it ran. I also knew that something was wrong before any alarm went off. Before any radio crackled. Before any military jet screamed overhead. Before the news helicopters showed up and started broadcasting that shaky, panicked footage that the whole world eventually saw on loop for 6 weeks. I knew because the birds stopped. Set up the world before. It was a Tuesday in early August, which in Florida means the air is basically a living creature itself. It sits on you. It presses down on your shoulders and gets into your lungs and makes you question every decision that led you to live in a state that essentially functions as the Earth's armpit from June through October. I had been out since 4 in the morning. That's normal for this kind of work. You go out early because the heat gets dangerous by 10. And because the animals are most active in those gray, half-lit hours before sunrise when the world hasn't quite committed to being daytime yet. I had my truck parked on a gravel pull-off on the north side of the Tamiami Trail, which is the road that cuts straight across the bottom of Florida like a scar. My gear was spread across the truck bed, binoculars, a waterproof notebook, a drone that the state had given me 6 months ago that I had crashed twice and repaired with zip ties and stubborn determination, a cooler with 2 bottles of water, 1 sports drink, and the aforementioned gas station sandwich, which I had purchased at the BP in Homestead at 3:45 in the morning from a cashier who looked at me with the specific exhaustion of someone who had given up asking why people bought things at 3:45 in the morning. I was watching a section of sawgrass prairie about a quarter-mile north of the road. There had been a reported sighting of a nesting snail kite in that area, a rare bird, protected, the kind of thing that generates paperwork when you find it and more paperwork when you don't, and my job was to confirm or deny. Standard stuff. The kind of morning I had had approximately 400 times in my career. The sky was doing what August skies do in South Florida. It was building. To the southwest, over the Gulf side, there were thunderheads already stacking up, these enormous white columns that look peaceful from a distance and turn into something violent if you're under them. The sunrise had been red that morning. Deep red, the kind that old fishermen take seriously. My grandfather used to say that a red sunrise was the sky telling you it had plans. I thought he meant weather. I was wrong about what kind of plans. The swamp around me was loud. That's the thing non-Floridians never understand about the Everglades. People imagine it as this silent, ominous place, all Spanish moss and creeping dread. And yes, it can be that, but mostly it's just relentlessly, aggressively alive. Frogs, birds, insects in numbers that suggest the concept of individual insects is a polite fiction. The sawgrass itself makes a sound when the wind moves through it, this dry, papery rustling that I had come to find genuinely comforting after 6 years. It sounded like the land was breathing. And then, at approximately 6:17 in the morning, it stopped breathing. The first sign. The frogs went quiet first. If you've never been in a place where the ambient biological noise of an entire ecosystem cuts off simultaneously, it is one of the most disorienting sounds you will ever not hear. It's not silence in the way a quiet room is silent. It's a removal. Like someone reached into the world and pulled something out of it. Like a frequency you didn't know you were hearing suddenly drops below the range of perception, and your brain knows something is missing even if your ears can't articulate what. I put down my binoculars. I looked around, slowly, the way you move when you're not sure if the danger is the kind that reacts to sudden movement. The birds were gone next, not in a panic, not the way they scatter when a hawk comes through, all noise and wing beats and alarm calls. They just left. One moment the tree line to my north had the normal complement of ibises and egrets doing their morning business, and the next moment it was empty, like they had received a memo and quietly filed out. The sawgrass stopped moving. There was no wind. I hadn't noticed the wind dying, which is the strange part. It was just gone. The air was completely still and completely silent and completely wrong in a way I could feel in my sternum. My truck's radio, which had been playing a country station out of Fort Myers at low volume, cut to static. I stood there for probably 10 seconds doing nothing except existing inside that wrongness, and then I looked west. The sky over the Everglades was purple. Not the normal purple of a pre-dawn sky, not the purple you get when the light catches a storm system at a certain angle. This was a deep, almost bruised purple, concentrated in a specific section of the sky maybe 20 degrees above the horizon, and it was moving, not fast, deliberately. The way a boat moves when someone knows exactly where they're going. And then the shape inside the purple light resolved. I have tried to describe this part approximately 300 times, to the military debriefers, to the journalists who found me, to my mother who called from Birmingham 16 times in the first 3 days after it happened. I have tried to find the right words, and I want to be honest with you. I haven't found them. Not really. The human vocabulary for large things was built around human scale, and what I was looking at was not built around human scale. It was big. I'll start there because that's where the brain starts. It goes to the simple measurements first because the complex ones are too much. It was big. The rough shape was something like a disc, but with projections underneath that I initially read as landing struts and later understood were weapons. The surface of it caught the early light and didn't reflect it normally. It absorbed most of it and gave back something slightly different, slightly wrong in color temperature. The way a cheap photograph of a sunset never quite captures what the sunset actually looked like. It was moving at a speed that should have created a sound. Anything that big, moving through atmosphere at that speed, should have been making a noise that I could feel in my back teeth. Instead, there was nothing. That silence I mentioned, it was emanating from the ship, not just absence of sound, actively consuming it. The ship was maybe 2 miles away when I first made out the shape. By the time I processed what I was looking at, it was less than half a mile. By the time I reached for my phone, it had stopped. It had stopped over the Everglades, over the western section of what we call the Big Cypress National Preserve, hundreds of thousands of acres of cypress swamp and sawgrass and shallow water that stretches toward the Gulf. It just sat there, hovering at maybe 500 feet, perfectly stable, the size of a small city. I called my supervisor, Marlena Voss. She answered on the second ring, which was unusual for 6:20 in the morning. "Darnell," she said. "Marlena," I said. "Are you seeing what I think you're seeing?" "Marlena," I'm on the Tamiami Trail east of Loop Road, and there's something over the swamp. I know, she said. I'm getting calls from 6 different locations. Just stay where you are. Do not drive toward it. I'm not driving toward it. I mean it, Darnell. Stay by your truck. Marlena, I'm very much staying by my truck. She hung up, and then I watched the ship begin its descent. The landing. It didn't land the way you'd expect. No dramatic crash, no explosion, no dust cloud. It came down slowly with the same deliberateness of its approach, and the cypress trees beneath it just folded away from the downwash of whatever was keeping it airborne. Not snapping, not burning, just bending, flattening. As if the ship was politely asking the vegetation to move, and the vegetation was politely complying. It settled into the water. The Everglades in that section runs about 6 inches to 2 feet deep over a limestone bedrock. It's not a swamp in the way Northerners imagine a swamp. It's actually a river, the slowest river in North America, a sheet of water 50 miles wide and 6 inches deep flowing south from Lake Okeechobee toward the Gulf. The ship sank into it until those projection struts found the limestone bedrock and locked. Then it sat. Half a mile away, in an ecosystem that contained, within immediate proximity of the landing site, approximately 47 American alligators that I personally had recorded in my survey data. Uncounted numbers of Burmese pythons, which are an invasive species that had taken over the southern Everglades with the kind of ruthless efficiency that suggests they didn't get the memo about being guests. Florida panthers, of which there were maybe 200 left in the world, most of them in this exact stretch of country. Black bears, wild boar, cottonmouth moccasins in numbers that would give a herpetologist nightmares. And the insects, Lord, the insects, the mosquitoes and the no-see-ums and the biting flies that had been tormenting living things in this ecosystem since before mammals existed. I thought about all of this while I stood by my truck and watched the ship sit there in the water. I thought whatever came out of that thing was about to have a very educational morning. They come out. The ramp or door or whatever it was didn't open for almost 20 minutes. I know because I was watching the time on my phone, partly because I'm the kind of person who tracks time even in extraordinary circumstances, and partly because I needed something specific and concrete to look at to keep my brain from doing something unhelpful like shutting down. At 6:41 a.m., a section of the ship's lower hull separated and extended downward. Not a ramp, exactly. More like the hull material itself liquefied at the seam and then resolidified at a different angle. I watched it happen and my brain filed it under things we will process later. What came out were soldiers. I didn't know that was what they were immediately. My first instinct was wrong. I thought they might be mechanical, some kind of drone, because they moved with that kind of uniform precision that we associate with machines. But they weren't machines. As they came down the ramp and into the shallow water of the Everglades, I could see them moving their heads, shifting their weight, interacting with each other in ways that were too subtle and too variable for automation. They were tall, 7 feet maybe more. The exosuits they wore, and I could see that the suits were suits, that there was something biological inside them, were dark, somewhere between gray and green, with a texture that looked almost organic, like the surface of a beetle's shell. The helmet portions were featureless, except for a horizontal slit at about eye level that glowed faintly amber. There were 12 of them in the first group. They came down into 6 inches of brown Everglades water and stood there for a moment, doing what I can only describe as assessing. One of them pointed toward the eastern tree line, in fact, roughly where I was standing, though I don't think they could see me at that distance. The group began to move. They were slow, not cautiously slow, arrogantly slow, moving through the water with the kind of deliberate, heavy confidence that says we are not afraid of this environment because we have decided the environment is not worth being afraid of. I later learned, from the intelligence reports that eventually got declassified, that the species we came to call the Vreth had a combat effectiveness rating, their own internal metric, that classified every environment type on a scale from 1 to 12. A 1 was essentially open space. A 12 was something like the surface of a hostile moon. The Everglades had been rated a 3 by a species that had conquered 11 other inhabited planets. They rated it a 3. Florida PUSHES back. The first alligator appeared 6 minutes after the soldiers entered the water. It came from the north, from a section of sawgrass that I knew well because I had once spent 45 minutes trying to free a monitoring drone from the same patch. It came the way alligators always come, not dramatically, not with warning, but as a gradual revelation. First, just a slight disturbance in the water's surface. Then the 2 small bumps of the eyes. Then, as it glided silently closer to the lead soldier, the full scale of what it was becoming apparent. It was a large one, maybe 11 feet. In the world of Everglades alligators, that's not unusual. We have 16-footers out there that have been logged and photographed and given informal names by the survey crews. But 11 feet of American alligator moving silently through dark water toward a 7-foot alien soldier is a specific kind of impressive. The soldier noticed it at about 15 feet. What happened next is something I have thought about many times, and I think what I was seeing was a species that had no evolutionary frame of reference for the American alligator. The soldier stopped. The amber slit in its helmet oriented toward the approaching shape. And then the soldier made a sound, not through any visible speaker or communication device, but through the suit itself, a low harmonic pulse that I felt more than heard, the kind of sound that is meant to establish dominance in a potential predator encounter. The alligator did not receive this message. The alligator did what alligators do, which is to say it did exactly what its nervous system has been refined over 200 million years to do. It had identified a large, warm thing in its territory, and it had initiated the standard response protocol. It attacked. The speed of an alligator strike from water is something that still surprises biologists even after a century of study. The animal goes from still to full acceleration in a fraction of a second, with no visible preparation, no warning posture, no telegraphing. One moment the alligator was gliding. The next moment 400 pounds of prehistoric killing architecture had clamped onto the soldier's right leg. The suit held. I want to be clear about that. Whatever that exosuit was made of, the initial bite didn't penetrate, but the alligator didn't let go either. And here's the thing about alligator behavior that I know from 6 years of field work, and that these aliens apparently did not know from any amount of galactic conquest. Alligators don't release when they bite. They roll. The death roll is not a dramatic finishing move like it's sometimes portrayed. It's a mechanical behavior, instinctive and precise. The alligator spins on its own axis to tear apart whatever it has in its mouth, or to drag it into the water, or both. 11 feet of alligator attached to your leg and spinning is not a situation that any tactical training prepares you for, because nothing in the known universe, or apparently the broader galaxy, had invented it before the Cretaceous and refined it for the next 65 million years. The soldier went down into 6 inches of water. And then the other alligators came, because alligators are not pack hunters, but they are opportunists, and the disturbance in the water was a signal that every alligator within 100 yards had been trained by evolution to recognize. I counted 7 distinct wakes moving toward the downed soldier's position. The other soldiers in the group raised weapons. I saw the weapons fire not a beam, not like science fiction, but something closer to a focused pressure wave that hit the water surface and sent spray 15 feet into the air. It killed 2 of the alligators. The other 5 kept coming. It took the 11 remaining soldiers approximately 4 minutes to extract their fallen companion and retreat to the ship's ramp. That companion was alive. I confirmed this from the way it moved, but it was moving with a noticeable favor of one side, and the suit, which had held the initial bite, had been compromised by the sustained mechanical force of multiple death rolls. The ramp retracted, the ship sat there. For 37 minutes, nothing moved. The military arrives. The first helicopters reached the area at 7:23. 2 Army Black Hawks, followed shortly by an Air Force drone the size of a small car that had been scrambled from MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. I know these details because I was on the phone with Marlena for most of this period, and she was on the phone with someone at the Florida Department of Emergency Management, who was on the phone with someone at the Pentagon, and information was moving through that chain like molasses through a cold pipe. What I observed directly, the helicopters circled at a distance of roughly a mile, not aggressive, observational. The Air Force drone went closer 300 yards and held station. The ship didn't respond to any of it. At 7:51, a second group emerged from the ship. This group was different. Larger 9 feet if they were an inch. Different suit configuration, heavier armored, with what were visibly weapons systems mounted on the shoulder section. And there were more of them, 30 in this group. They also moved more carefully this time. I could see them checking the water before each step, which I found grimly satisfying. They had learned something from the alligators. They were being methodical. They were not, however, prepared for the python. The python problem. I should explain the Burmese python situation in South Florida, because it's relevant to everything that follows, and because it's one of those things that sounds like hyperbole until you understand the actual scale of it. Burmese pythons are not native to Florida. They arrived through the exotic pet trade, people who bought baby pythons and then released them when they grew too large to manage, which is what happens when you buy an animal that grows to 23 feet and 400 pounds. They have been in the Everglades ecosystem since at least the 1980s. By 2031, the population estimates ranged from 30,000 to 100,000 individuals. They had eaten approximately 96% of the medium-sized mammal population in South Florida. 96%. They are ambush predators. They do not chase. They wait, often submerged or concealed in vegetation for days at a time, and then they strike with speed and constrict with force. A large adult Burmese python exerts constriction pressure in the range of 15 to 18 pounds per square inch, which is more than enough to stop circulation in a human. Or, as it turned out, in whatever circulatory system was inside an alien exosuit. The second group of soldiers was 20 meters into the water when the python struck. It came from beneath. They hunt in water regularly, something a lot of people don't realize, and it wrapped around the lead soldier before the soldier or any of its companions had processed what was happening. The soldier reacted with obvious alarm. The suit systems activated. I could see some kind of charge passing over the surface, a blue-white shimmer that would have been intensely unpleasant for anything with a conventional nervous system. The python did not have a conventional nervous system. The python had a nervous system designed by 40 million years of evolution to not let go of things, and the electric charge disrupted its muscle coordination briefly, but did not break the constriction. The other soldiers in the group aimed their weapons, and here is where they encountered problem number 2. A 22-foot python wrapped around your companion in shallow water is not a target that exists in isolation. The python and the soldier were interlocked. Firing at the python meant firing at the soldier. 3 of the other soldiers tried to physically intervene. They grabbed the python. This, from a behavioral standpoint, was understandable. From a practical standpoint, it introduced them to problem number 3. The python's tail end, which was not occupied with constricting anything, began wrapping around one of the intervening soldiers as an automatic response to being grabbed. The animal did not decide to do this. It just did it. 2 soldiers immobilized. From one snake. The group's leader, I identified it by the different marking on its helmet, made a decision. It aimed and fired at the water surface next to the snake, not at the snake. The pressure wave displaced an enormous quantity of water and the snake released, sliding back under the surface. Both compromised soldiers were retrieved. Neither appeared able to walk normally. The group retreated a second time to the ship. By this point, I had been standing next to my truck for over an hour. My gas station sandwich was still in my hand. I had not taken a second bite since the ship landed. My phone had 17 missed calls, which I was choosing not to think about. The swamp was making sounds again. The frogs had come back. The birds were returning to the tree line in small groups, the way they do after a disturbance, tentative, then more confident, then fully resumed. As if the ecosystem was recalibrating around the new presence and deciding it was manageable. I looked at the ship sitting in the Everglades water and thought about what else lived in those 50,000 acres between the ship and civilization. I thought they have no idea what DARNELL did next. I know I said I wasn't going to drive toward the ship. I want to be clear that what I did was not driving toward the ship. I drove south, toward the loop road, which was actually moving away from the ship's position. Then I turned west on the loop road, which runs parallel to the Tamiami Trail through a section of Big Cypress that is poorly marked, frequently flooded, and not shown correctly on any commercial GPS system. Then I stopped at a pull-off that I knew from 6 years of field work, a raised limestone outcropping maybe 30 feet above the surrounding water level, which in Everglades terms is essentially a mountain. From this position, I was maybe 3/4 of a mile from the ship, close enough to observe in detail. Far enough that I wasn't visible from the hull. I set up my field spotting scope on its tripod, 37 power magnification. I began taking notes. And I began recording video on my phone, propped against the spotting scope's eyepiece. A trick I had learned for recording birds that I never expected to use for this. The footage that eventually became known as the Hutchins feed, the first sustained ground-level video documentation of REF forces in contact with a terrestrial environment, was shot in this manner, on a 3-year-old personal phone, braced against a wildlife survey telescope, by a state employee who was technically not supposed to be within a mile of the landing site. I want to be clear about one more thing. I was scared. I don't want to tell this story in a way that makes me sound like I was cool and professional the whole time, because that would be a lie. My hands were not entirely steady. My mouth was dry in a way that one sports drink did not fix. Every time something moved in my peripheral vision, and things were constantly moving, because I was in the middle of the Everglades, I had a half-second of full-body alarm response that I then had to talk myself down from. I was also not leaving. That's the Florida part. I can't explain it better than that. You live in this state long enough, you deal with enough hurricanes and flood events and the particular chaos that South Florida generates as a matter of routine, and you develop a stubbornness that isn't quite bravery but functions similarly in the moment. You don't leave. You stay and you watch and you deal with what's happening. It's probably a character flaw, but it's ours. The third attempt, and the ecosystem responds. At 9:47 in the morning, the ship's hull opened again. This time, it wasn't soldiers that came out first. What emerged from the ship were machines. Drones, but not like our drones. These were roughly spherical, maybe 4 feet in diameter, with a surface that constantly shifted and rearranged, small mechanical elements moving and reconfiguring in patterns that seemed purposeful. They deployed in a pattern, spreading out in a roughly circular formation around the ship at a radius of about half a mile, setting up a perimeter. Smart, they were establishing control of the immediate area before putting soldiers in it again. The drones moved through the sawgrass and over the water with no difficulty. One of them passed within 50 yards of my position on the limestone outcrop. I stopped breathing for approximately 15 seconds. It passed without changing course. After the drones had established the perimeter, a third group of soldiers emerged. Larger still, I counted 42. And they were moving differently. No more deliberate waiting. They had some kind of system attached to their boots that created a small pressure differential, letting them move across the water surface rather than through it, hovering an inch above the surface. It looked like something out of a dream, 42 tall, dark figures gliding across the brown water of the Everglades in the morning heat. They headed east, toward civilization, toward the Tamiami Trail and everything beyond it. The perimeter drones began sweeping outward, clearing a corridor. One drone swept directly over a section of sawgrass, 50 meters north of the eastern soldier column. I was watching that area through my scope because I had noted the sawgrass doing something earlier, moving against the slight breeze that had returned, moving in a pattern that was wrong for wind. A Florida panther hit one of the perimeter drones from above. I don't know how else to say that. The panther, an adult female I estimated, based on the size, had been in the cypress tree directly above the drone's path. She dropped onto it the way a domestic cat drops onto a toy, except she weighed about 120 pounds and she was coming from 15 feet up. The impact drove the drone into the water. She had it pinned under her forepaws before it could right itself. The drone's response was the same electric charge I had seen from the soldier, the blue-white shimmer. The panther released, leaped backward, shook her head with evident irritation, and was back in the cypress canopy in approximately 3 seconds. The drone was disabled. Its surface was no longer reconfiguring. 2 soldiers in the column broke formation to investigate, which meant 2 soldiers were standing still in shallow water while the column continued forward. 2 stationary soldiers in shallow water in the Everglades for any extended period of time. The cottonmouth hit the boot seam of the closer one at 9:53. A cottonmouth moccasin, Agkistrodon piscivorus, the water moccasin, is the only venomous semi-aquatic snake in North America. It's bad-tempered by reptile standards, which is saying something. The adult individual that struck the soldier was not large, maybe 4 feet, but it struck 3 times in rapid succession, which is characteristic of the species when threatened. The exosuit again held the penetration. The venom did not get in. But the impact of 3 rapid strikes at the boot seam apparently registered as something significant inside that suit, because the soldier made the sound again, the harmonic pulse, the one that was supposed to mean I am dominant, reconsider. And again, the Florida wildlife did not receive this message in the spirit it was intended. The second cottonmouth that was drawn by the surface disturbance struck the other soldier's lower leg casing before anyone had time to react. I am not exaggerating when I tell you that by 10:15 in the morning, the Vreth had attempted 3 separate deployments into the Everglades ecosystem and had sustained casualties in all 3. Not deaths. The suits were built to handle environments that made South Florida look hospitable, and they were doing their job, but the soldiers were being degraded, compromised. Their combat effectiveness was being chipped away by an ecosystem that was not in any way coordinating or strategizing, that was not fighting them, that was simply being itself. The Everglades does not care who you are or where you came from. It is indifferent to your species and your technology and your history of conquest. It has been killing things for 6 million years, and it has no opinions about what it kills. This, I was beginning to understand, was going to be a problem for the Vreth. Contact and what happened at the trail. At 10:41, the main column of soldiers reached the Tamiami Trail. I know this because I could hear it. Not the soldiers themselves, they moved in near silence, but the reactions. car horns from the highway, which suggested the column had emerged from the water onto the road surface, which is a two-lane highway with essentially no shoulder. The sound of engines being shut off, voluntary or otherwise, I couldn't tell. Some kind of disturbance that carried across the flat, sound-conducting landscape. Then something I could see from my outcrop position, a light rising from the highway area. Blue-white, like the charge pulse but larger, covering maybe 100 meters of airspace. It pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Then nothing. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered it because it was either the military or someone asking about my car's extended warranty, and either seemed like it deserved a response. "Mr. Hutchins," said a voice on the other end, female, calm in the way that people who have been trained extensively to sound calm under pressure sound calm. "This is Colonel Patricia Vostanforth with the Joint Emergency Operations Command. We have located your vehicle on the loop road and we're aware that you are observing the contact site." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "We need your observations. Can you maintain your current position for the next hour and provide a verbal feed?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I can do that. I'm also recording video." There was a brief pause. "Keep recording. Do not transmit. We will collect the footage directly. Can you describe what you're currently observing?" And that is how Darnell Hutchins, wildlife survey technician, became an intelligence asset in the first extraterrestrial contact event in human history. For the next 40 minutes, I narrated everything I saw into a phone held by a colonel I'd never met, describing alien soldiers navigating the edge of the Everglades, while the ecosystem around them continued doing what it always does, which is to say it continued being the single most effective biological threat environment on the North American continent. The fire ants. At 11:10, I saw something that made me stop mid-sentence. The column had established a position along the highway shoulder. Several soldiers were standing on the elevated road surface, only about 2 feet above the water line, but apparently considered secure ground. They had what appeared to be communication equipment active, a structure extending from one soldier's backpack that pulsed with the same amber light as their helmet visors. They were trying to establish contact with someone. Command ship, something. While they did this, 3 soldiers stood in a loose perimeter on the gravel shoulder of the Tamiami Trail. I have watched a lot of wildlife in my career. I have developed an eye for things that other people miss in a landscape. And what I noticed, while narrating the scene to Colonel Vostanforth, was that the gravel shoulder around the soldiers' feet was moving. Fire ants. Red imported fire ants, Solnopsis invicta, are another invasive species in Florida, originally from South America, established in the southeast since the 1930s, now present in essentially every disturbed habitat in the state. Their mound is distinctive if you know what to look for. A dome of worked soil, sometimes a foot high, with no obvious entrance holes on the surface because the entry tunnels run underground. The mound near the soldier's position was visible to me through the scope. I had not flagged it because fire ants were not part of what I was cataloging. The soldiers were standing on a fire ant mound. Or rather, they had disrupted a fire ant mound with their footing, and the colony, which could contain 200,000 individuals, was responding the way fire ant colonies respond to ground disturbance, which is to say with immediate, total, coordinated mobilization. The ants moved up the soldiers' suits. Now, I need to be honest about what I expected next, which was nothing. I expected that fire ants on an alien exosuit would accomplish nothing, that they would be ineffective against the same materials that had shrugged off alligator bites and python constriction. Fire ants on a surface they can't penetrate are just annoying. What I did not expect was that the suit seams had air exchange ports. I learned later, from the technical analysis of the suits recovered from subsequent engagements, that the Vreth exosuits had a sophisticated environmental interface system, The suits were not fully sealed like a spacesuit. They were designed to interact with the surrounding atmosphere, to take in environmental data, to adjust their internal environment based on external conditions. The ports were small millimeter scale, too small for most things, certainly too small for a cottonmouth's fang. Fire ants are 2 to 6 millimeters long. The mobilizing colony found the ports within 4 minutes of the soldiers standing on their mound. The first ants into the suit apparently triggered the emergency seal response, but not before a significant quantity of the colony had followed the exploratory scouts through the port openings. The 3 soldiers on the gravel shoulder were abruptly not calm. Fire ant stings are not like bee stings. They inject an alkaloid venom called solnopsin that creates an intense, burning sensation, the fire in fire ant. A single sting is unpleasant. Dozens of simultaneous stings, delivered inside a sealed suit where the occupant cannot brush the ants off, is something considerably worse. 2 of the 3 soldiers ran, not tactically, just ran into the water submerging. The water apparently didn't dislodge the ants immediately. Fire ants can form waterproof rafts from their own bodies, a behavior that allowed them to survive flooding long enough to become an ecological nightmare. But it disrupted the delivery of additional ants into the suit. The 3rd soldier, to its credit, did not run. It stood and dealt with whatever was happening inside its armor with a stillness that I actually respected, until its companion with the communication array grabbed it by the arm and pulled it toward the water. Communication interrupted, column disrupted, 4 soldiers compromised by a colony of ants. Colonel Voss Danforth on my phone said, in the tone of someone who is writing something down, "Fire ants." "Fire ants," I confirmed. "The Everglades just." "Florida, ma'am," I said. "It's not just the Everglades, it's all of it." What they didn't know about Florida. Here is what I didn't say to the colonel at that moment, because there wasn't time, but what I was thinking. The Vreth had apparently assessed Florida the way any reasonable outside observer would assess it. They had looked at it from orbit and seen a flat, low-lying peninsula with a mild to warm climate and a relatively small human population density in the southern sections. They had noted the wetland coverage and presumably rated it as difficult terrain. They had identified it as a landing zone that would give them room to establish a beachhead away from major human population centers while they set up their initial contact, or their initial invasion, depending on how you read the body language of 42 armed soldiers. What their assessment had not accounted for was the specific, singular, absolutely deranged character of Florida's ecological, and as it would turn out, human landscape. They had landed in the one state in America where the wildlife was essentially a collection of animals that evolution, invasion ecology, and decades of environmental chaos had collectively decided were going to be as durable and as difficult as possible. The alligators were the most obvious. The pythons were the most dramatic. The panthers and the cottonmouths and the fire ants were just the early rounds. They had not yet encountered the wild boar. They had not yet encountered the mosquito swarms of the August evening, which in the Everglades reach densities that can disorient and physically impair unprotected humans, and it would turn out, interfere with certain sensor systems in ways that the Vreth's equipment designers had not anticipated. They had not yet encountered a Florida man. The first contact that actually mattered. At 1:17 in the afternoon, while the Vreth were reassembled on and around their ship, and apparently engaged in what all the subsequent analysis agreed was a serious internal discussion, a pickup truck appeared on the Tamiami Trail heading west. It was a 2019 Ford F-250, silver, substantial, the kind of truck that in South Florida means the driver either works in construction or ranching, or they are making a statement about what kind of person they are. From the look of it, the gear rack in the bed, the mud on the tires, the aftermarket antenna cluster on the cab roof, This was a working truck, not a statement. It did not stop at the military checkpoint, because by this point the military checkpoint on the trail was positioned east of my location, not west, and whoever was driving this truck had apparently come in from the Collier County side. The truck slowed when it approached the Vreth perimeter drones, 3 of which were still functional and were maintaining a loose surveillance corridor across the highway. Then it stopped, the engine stayed running. Then the driver's door opened. The person who got out was a man of approximately 60, wide shoulders, permanently sun-darkened skin, a white t-shirt with the logo of a bait shop that had closed in 2024, knee-length cargo shorts, the specific gait of someone who has spent decades walking on uneven terrain and whose body has just made its peace with it. He stood next to his truck and looked at the drones. Then he looked at the ship, still sitting in the water half a mile off the highway. He put his hands on his hips. He looked at all of this for maybe 30 seconds. Then he got back in his truck, reached into the back seat, and came back out holding a Yeti cooler. He set the cooler on the hood of his truck, opened it, retrieved a can of something. I could not see the label from my position, and leaned against the front of the truck, looking at the ship. He opened the can. The drones did not approach him. They maintained their positions, which suggested some of the Vreth sensors were running analysis on him, classifying the threat level, deciding what he was. From the ship, a single soldier emerged and waded toward the highway. Just one. No weapons raised, moving slowly, clearly presenting itself as a non-aggressive contact attempt. The man with the can watched it come. The soldier climbed from the water onto the highway shoulder and stood about 15 feet away from the man with the can. They looked at each other. The man took a drink. Then he reached into the cooler, pulled out a second can, and held it out. The soldier looked at the offered can for a moment that probably contained more diplomatic significance than any formal contact protocol could have generated. Then it extended a gauntlet-covered hand and took it. I don't know what was in those cans. I've tried to find out. Nobody who was in a position to know has told me definitively. But what happened next, the Vreth commander, who I didn't know was watching from a position inside the ship's open hull section, apparently saw enough in that exchange to hold the advance. The name I eventually learned for the man with the cooler was Cledes Broward. He had been fishing the west side of the Everglades his entire life. He owned 12 acres in Collier County. He had survived 3 major hurricanes, one encounter with a 16-foot alligator that he referred to as the disagreement, and a bout with a particularly unpleasant variety of skin infection that he had treated himself with what he described as stuff from the hardware store. He was not a diplomat. He was not trained in any kind of contact protocol. He had no authority to represent anyone or anything. He also was not afraid. And the Vreth, whose entire combat doctrine was apparently built around the premise that biological intimidation was the primary tool of control, that the visual weight and physical presence of their soldiers would generate a predictable fear response that established the terms of engagement, encountered in Cledes Broward something they had apparently not encountered before. Something that looked at 7 feet of alien soldier and offered it a beverage. This, the intelligence analysts would eventually note, was actually the first moment in the contact timeline where the Vreth's tactical projections began to fail in ways that weren't ecological. Nightfall, the real test begins. By 5 in the afternoon, the August sun was beginning its descent, and the temperature had dropped to approximately 91 degrees, which in Florida counts as late afternoon pleasant. The air was thickening again, the way it does before an evening storm, and to the southwest the sky was doing the thing it does every August evening in South Florida, which is to say it was building something enormous and electrical and loud. The Vreth had not left. They had also not advanced. Their ship sat in the same position it had occupied since morning, Their soldiers were visible on the ship's hull and in positions around it, apparently watchful. The perimeter drones that remained functional were maintaining their corridors. It had the look of a force that was waiting for something, an answer, new orders, a reassessment. What they were getting instead was the Everglades evening shift. Because during the day the Everglades is difficult, at night it's something else. At dusk, the mosquitoes came out, not in the numbers you're imagining. More than that, South Florida's Everglades mosquito populations in August reached densities that the Centers for Disease Control have classified as requiring industrial countermeasures for any sustained human presence. The specific combination of fresh and brackish water, dense vegetation, high humidity, and the particular thermal conditions of the glades creates an environment where Culex and Eads populations reach numbers that honest biologists describe with terms like overwhelming and biblical. I had my head net on and my permethrin-treated clothing, and I was still getting welts on my wrists. The Vreth apparently had not tested their sensor array in a mosquito swarm of this density. I watched, through my scope in the fading light, as the functional perimeter drones began to behave erratically. Not failing, the mosquitoes were too small to impact the drones mechanically, but the sensor apertures were apparently clogging, or the biological mass of millions of mosquitoes in the air was creating interference in whatever sensing system the drones used to navigate and identify targets. Two drones flew into each other. One flew directly into the water surface and did not re-emerge. The soldiers who had been stationed outside the ship's hull retreated inside. The ship sat in the Everglades. The Everglades made its sounds at the ship. The frogs were very loud that evening. At 7:49 p.m., the first lightning strike of the evening storm hit the cypress forest approximately half a mile north of the ship. The thunder was immediate and very large, flat Florida, with nothing to interrupt the acoustic propagation of an August storm at close range, generates a thunder that you feel in your ribcage. The flash illuminated the ship and the water around it and everything in between. In that flash, I saw the gators. Alligators in the Everglades are detectable at night by their eyeshine, the tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina that makes their eyes glow red-orange in any light source. In the lightning flash, there were eyes everywhere, dozens of them in the water around the ship, not approaching, just present, watching. The way alligators watch things from the water, which is a watching that contains no urgency because alligators have all the time in the world. The ship had landed in the middle of their territory, and they were watching it the way they watch everything, patiently, as if they were waiting to see what the next interesting thing would be. End of part 1. I stayed on that limestone outcrop until almost 9 in the evening. Colonel Vostanforth checked in with me every 30 minutes. I described what I was seeing. I kept the phone camera running. My battery was at 7% when the military vehicle finally found the loop road and came for me. A Humvee driven by a young corporal who looked approximately 19 years old, and who asked me if I was okay with the specific tone of someone who had been told to ask that question regardless of the answer. I told him I was fine. I looked back once at the ship, sitting in the dark water of the Everglades, ringed by the eyeshine of alligators and the sound of frogs and the building lightning of the August storm. I thought about what was still out there. Wild boar rooting through the cypress hummocks, panthers moving through the darkness that they owned completely, pythons in the water, their thermal sensing pit organs active and scanning, raccoons, which in Florida are a special category of creature unto themselves, the mosquitoes, the biting flies, the no-see-ums, which are so small they pass through standard screen mesh and whose bite is approximately 6 times more irritating than a mosquito's relative to the insect's body size. And beyond the swamp, Florida's human population, which is its own category of ecological challenge. The Vreth had come to a planet they thought they understood. They had landed in Florida. They had not yet met the morning.